He was 8 years old, and the system had already failed him. Gabriel Fernandez. When protection failed. This is not a story about a child who disappeared without a trace. It is the story of a child who was seen, documented, and returned again and again. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old when he died. In the years before his death, his injuries were noticed, his words were recorded, his situation was reported to the authorities responsible for protecting him. Schools followed procedure, hospitals treated his wounds, social services opened files, conducted visits, and closed cases. And each time, Gabriel went home. This documentary does not ask whether the system existed. This is the story of Gabriel Fernandez and the system that sent him back. Gabriel Fernandez was born on February 20th, 2005 in California. His life lasted only 8 years, yet his name would later appear across countless official records, school files, medical reports, social service documents. Long before his case reached courtrooms and headlines, Gabriel already existed within a system designed to protect children, even if that protection never fully reached him. At school, Gabriel was known as a quiet child. He followed instructions, avoided conflict, and rarely drew attention to himself. Teachers described him as polite and respectful, a student who listened carefully and tried to do what was asked of him. He did not disrupt lessons. He did not demand help. He blended into the background of the classroom. Gabriel's daily routine reflected that same caution. During class, he spoke softly when spoken to. During breaks, he often stayed close to adults rather than joining other children at play. He did not complain when he was hurt. He did not rush to explain himself. In hindsight, educators would describe him as a child who seemed careful not to take up space, as if he had learned that being noticed could come with consequences. Nothing about Gabriel suggested rebellion or aggression. There were no behavioral warnings, no disciplinary concerns. What stood out instead was his silence, a silence that did not signal calm, but endurance. Long before anyone intervened, Gabriel was already learning how to survive quietly. When Gabriel was returned to his mother's custody, the decision was recorded as a resolution. Court documents reflected that concerns had been reviewed and addressed. From an administrative perspective, the case appeared stable, but stability on paper did not mean safety in reality. Gabriel was sent back to live with his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her partner, Isauro Aguirre, in Palmdale, California. The home itself did not raise immediate alarms. It was a modest house in a residential neighborhood, visually indistinguishable from others nearby. There were no outward signs of danger, no obvious indicators that would draw attention from a passing observer. Inside the home, however, Gabriel's life followed a different set of rules. Other children lived there, but Gabriel was treated separately. According to later testimony, he was singled out, controlled, and isolated in ways the other children were not. This difference was not subtle, and it was not temporary. It became routine. Gabriel's movements were restricted. His access to common spaces was limited. While others in the household followed ordinary daily rhythms, Gabriel's day was governed by permission and punishment. Over time, his world grew smaller. One of the most disturbing aspects of this environment was where Gabriel was made to sleep. He was often confined to a small cabinet, shut away from the rest of the home. This was not a single incident or an improvised solution. It became a repeated practice. Night after night, the cabinet replaced a bed. Darkness replaced comfort. Food was not guaranteed. Gabriel was frequently denied meals, while others ate regularly. Hunger became a constant presence rather than an occasional punishment. This deprivation weakened him physically and contributed to the visible deterioration that would later be noticed at school and in medical settings. Daily life inside the house was shaped by fear. According to later accounts, Gabriel learned to comply quickly and speak as little as possible. Silence was safer than explanation. Obedience became a survival strategy. Despite these conditions, the household remained under observation without interruption. Social workers visited the home, notes were taken, questions were asked. Each visit ended with the same conclusion: Gabriel remained where he was. Some visits were brief, others focused on surface-level checks rather than sustained observation. In certain instances, Gabriel was not interviewed privately. When caregivers were present, the opportunity for honest disclosure diminished further. The system acknowledged the home, it documented the household, it recorded interactions. What it did not do was disrupt the environment that continued to harm Gabriel. Each time Gabriel was returned through the same door, the decision reinforced a dangerous assumption that endurance could substitute for protection. This house was not invisible to authorities. It was known, it was visited, it was evaluated. And yet for Gabriel, it remained the most dangerous place he knew. At school, the signs did not appear all at once. They accumulated. Over time, Gabriel Fernandez began arriving with injuries that raised concern. Bruises on his face, marks on his arms, wounds that did not align with ordinary childhood accidents. These were not singular moments. They returned again and again. Teachers noticed changes in Gabriel's behavior alongside the physical signs. He became increasingly withdrawn. His posture was guarded. He avoided eye contact when questioned. When spoken to directly, he often paused before responding, as if carefully choosing his words. The classroom, a space meant to provide stability, became another place where Gabriel moved cautiously. One of Gabriel's teachers took particular notice. She documented what she saw in detail following mandated reporting procedures. Her reports were specific. They included dates, descriptions of injuries, and observations of Gabriel's demeanor. These reports were not speculative. They were grounded in repeated, visible evidence. On more than one occasion, Gabriel spoke about what was happening to him. He told school staff that his mother and her boyfriend were hurting him. These disclosures were recorded and forwarded to Child Protective Services as required by law. According to policy, such statements should have triggered immediate protective action. As time passed, the reports continued. New injuries appeared before older ones had healed. The process repeated itself. Concern was raised, documentation was completed, and notifications were sent. Each time, the expectation was that intervention would follow. Medical professionals also encountered warning signs. Gabriel was taken to emergency rooms with injuries that did not match the explanations given by the adults who brought him in. Falls were cited. Accidents were blamed. Treatment focused on addressing the immediate injury, not investigating its cause. The injuries accumulated in medical records as isolated events: broken ribs, burns, missing teeth, head trauma. Each injury was documented individually without being fully connected to a broader pattern of sustained abuse. Social workers were notified repeatedly. Home visits followed. Interviews were conducted. In some instances, Gabriel was not interviewed privately. In others, conversations were brief and limited. The environment in which questions were asked did not allow for safety or honesty. Each intervention followed the same structure: a report, a visit, an assessment, a conclusion. And at the end of each cycle, Gabriel remained in the home. What makes this chapter especially difficult is not that the signs were subtle. They were visible, they were documented, they were repeated over months. The warnings were not hidden within silence. They were written into official records. Gabriel was not overlooked. He was observed. He was reported. He was heard. The failure was not one of recognition, but of response. Seeing the signs was not the problem. Responding to them was. By the time Gabriel Fernandez's case reached its later stages, the system was no longer uninformed. Child Protective Services had been alerted multiple times. Schools had submitted reports. Medical records documented repeated injuries. What failed was not awareness, but the chain of decisions that followed that awareness. Gabriel's case moved through the Department of Children and Family Services over an extended period. Different social workers became involved at different times. Each transition fragmented the history of the case. No single individual carried uninterrupted responsibility. Instead, the case existed as a series of disconnected entries, reviewed in parts rather than as a whole. Each report was handled within procedure. Intake forms were completed. Risk assessments were conducted. Home visits were scheduled. On paper, these actions suggested diligence. In practice, they created a pattern of temporary attention followed by closure. Home visits often took place with caregivers present. In some instances, Gabriel was not interviewed alone. When questions were asked in environments controlled by those responsible for the abuse, honest disclosure became nearly impossible. Silence, once again, was safer. There were moments when concern escalated. Notes reflected acknowledgement of risk. Discussions took place about potential removal. But the standard for intervention remained high. Each time, the conclusion was the same. There was insufficient evidence to justify immediate action. One of the most damaging aspects of the system's response was its reliance on individual explanations rather than cumulative patterns. Each injury was evaluated separately. Each report was assessed in isolation. The broader trajectory of harm was never fully assembled into a single urgent picture. Communication between agencies was inconsistent. Schools documented concerns and forwarded them to social services. Hospitals treated injuries and recorded explanations. These records existed simultaneously, but they were not always integrated. Information remained siloed within departments that were meant to function collaboratively. As time passed, the lack of decisive action became normalized. The same conclusions were reached repeatedly, even as circumstances worsened. What began as caution gradually turned into routine. Gabriel was returned to the same home again and again. Each return reinforced an institutional assumption that the environment was survivable. Protection was deferred, risk was recalculated, responsibility was redistributed. The failure of the system was not the result of a single error or one individual's neglect. It was the outcome of a process that prioritized procedure over urgency, documentation over disruption. By the time intervention might have mattered most, the system had already convinced itself that waiting was acceptable. In the final weeks of Gabriel Fernandez's life, the situation did not stabilize. It deteriorated. The harm that had once appeared intermittent became increasingly constant. Injuries appeared more frequently, and the periods between them grew shorter. Yet, externally, nothing about the response changed. At school, Gabriel's condition was impossible to ignore. Teachers noticed that he seemed physically weaker. He struggled to sit comfortably for extended periods of time. His movements were careful, restrained, as though even small actions carried pain. New injuries appeared alongside older ones that had not yet healed. These observations were documented, just as they had been before. Reports were written. Concerns were raised. The expectation remained that intervention would finally follow. But once again, no emergency removal occurred. Gabriel continued to return home at the end of each school day. During this period, Gabriel's access to normal daily life at home continued to shrink. Food deprivation persisted. Isolation became more frequent. According to later testimony, fear governed his routine. He learned to comply quickly, to speak less, to make himself as unobtrusive as possible. Medical attention was sought only when injuries became severe enough to require it. When Gabriel was taken to hospitals, the focus remained on immediate treatment rather than long-term protection. Explanations were accepted. The broader context was left unchallenged. As weeks passed, the cumulative impact on Gabriel's body became evident. He showed signs of malnourishment. His injuries existed at different stages of healing, indicating repeated trauma over time. Individually, some injuries might not have been fatal. Together, they placed unbearable strain on his body. In the days leading up to his death, Gabriel's physical state worsened noticeably. He appeared exhausted, weakened. According to later findings, his body was no longer able to absorb further harm. On May 24, 2013, emergency services were called after Gabriel collapsed at home. He was transported to the hospital unresponsive. Medical staff attempted life-saving measures, but the injuries were catastrophic. Doctors determined that Gabriel had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in a fatal brain injury. Despite intervention, there was no recovery. Gabriel Fernandez was pronounced dead later that day. He was 8 years old. Gabriel Fernandez's death did not remain a private tragedy. Once the circumstances became public, the case triggered a wave of national outrage. What had previously existed behind closed case files was now exposed to scrutiny. The focus shifted not only to the individuals who harmed Gabriel, but to every institution that had failed to intervene. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of child abuse and torture. From the outset, prosecutors described the case as one of prolonged and deliberate cruelty. This was not presented as a single moment of violence, but as a sustained pattern of abuse over time. During the trial, the courtroom was confronted with extensive medical evidence. Autopsy findings detailed injuries across Gabriel's body, fractures, burns, internal damage, and signs of repeated trauma. Medical experts testified that the injuries occurred over an extended period, contradicting any suggestion of isolated accidents. Witness testimony reinforced this picture. Statements described the conditions inside the home, Gabriel's isolation, and the differential treatment between him and the other children. The jury was presented with a timeline that showed not only how Gabriel was harmed, but how long that harm continued without interruption. The emotional weight of the evidence was significant. Portions of the trial required careful handling due to the nature of the material. Even within the courtroom, there were limits to what could be shown or described. The case tested the boundaries of how much suffering could be documented without becoming unbearable. In 2018, the verdicts were delivered. Pearl Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Isauro Aguirre was sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment following changes to California's death penalty laws. The court acknowledged the severity and duration of the abuse in its sentencing, but the legal response did not end there. Attention turned to the Department of Children and Family Services. 4 social workers and 2 supervisors were charged with felony child abuse and falsification of public records. Prosecutors argued that they had failed to act despite clear evidence of danger. These cases became some of the most controversial aspects of the aftermath. Defense attorneys argued that the workers had followed procedure and operated within systemic constraints. Prosecutors argued that procedure did not excuse inaction. The trials highlighted how difficult it is to assign criminal responsibility within bureaucratic systems. Ultimately, several charges were dismissed and others resulted in acquittals. While the outcome was legally conclusive, it left many observers dissatisfied. Accountability appeared fragmented. Responsibility was debated rather than resolved. The trials exposed a deeper problem, that systems designed to protect children often distribute responsibility so widely that failure becomes difficult to punish. In Gabriel's case, the courtroom provided answers but not closure. Gabriel Fernandez was not an unknown child. His name appeared in reports long before it appeared in headlines. His injuries were documented. His words were recorded. His situation was observed by adults whose responsibility was to protect him. This is what makes his case impossible to dismiss as a tragedy that happened in silence. Gabriel did not vanish between the cracks. He stood inside them, visible from every angle. Each institution involved performed a role. Schools followed reporting procedures. Medical professionals treated injuries. Social services conducted visits and assessments. Individually, each action could be justified as compliant with policy. Together, they created a system that watched harm continue without interruption. Gabriel's story exposes a dangerous truth about institutional failure. When responsibility is divided among many hands, urgency weakens, decisions slow, risk becomes a calculation rather than a call to act. What begins as caution gradually turns into acceptance. After the trials ended and the headlines faded, Gabriel's name remained attached to reform discussions, policy reviews, and public debates. His case became a reference point, cited in reports, training materials, and hearings. Yet reform, like accountability, moved slowly. For many, the outcome felt incomplete. The people who harmed Gabriel were punished. The system that failed him was examined, criticized, and defended, but never fully transformed. The gap between awareness and action remained. Remembering Gabriel Fernandez is not about recounting every detail of his suffering. It is about refusing to let those details be reduced to paperwork, procedure, or hindsight. It is about acknowledging that warning signs lose their meaning when they are allowed to repeat without consequence. Gabriel lived in full view of the system built to protect him. His death forces a question that cannot be comfortably answered. How many times can a child be seen, reported, and returned before protection becomes optional? This story does not end with a verdict. It does not end with policy reviews or public outrage. It continues wherever warning signs are documented but not acted upon, because stories do not end. They echo. Gabriel Fernandez did not disappear without a trace. He was seen, he was reported, he was returned, again and again. This case is not remembered because the signs were hidden. It is remembered because they were documented and still ignored. Gabriel's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. A system can exist, follow procedure, and still fail completely. While institutions waited, a child endured. Next on True Echoes. Gabriel Fernandez was not the only child the system failed. Warnings were raised, the signs were there, the system was aware, help was asked for, and still the outcome did not change. Another child was sent back. Next, Adrian Jones, the boy who asked for help. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Gabriel Fernandez did not disappear without a trace. This case is not remembered because the signs were hidden. It is remembered because they were documented and still ignored. And that is why this story still echoes. What do you think failed first in this case? The system or the people within it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.